You know, there was a time in the life of Jesus, and this is recorded in every one of the synoptic gospels, that Jesus is doing his ministry. He's healing the sick. He's telling these incredible parables. He's declaring to the world that the kingdom of God is at hand. So turn from the way you've been doing things and turn toward this kingdom way. And he's ministering, he's speaking, he's touching the poor and the broken, and he's exhausted. And he says to his boys, hey, let's jump in the boat and cross the Sea of Galilee and go to the other side. And so they jump in the boat, and they're all going across. And Jesus falls asleep in the back of the boat. And it's a pretty famous story. I mean, it's famous for a number of reasons. One, that it's recorded in all three of the synoptic gospels, but also because it's one of those stories that on the face, like when you look at the initial story, Jesus sleeping in the midst of a storm is a bizarre idea. And that's really the context of the story, is that Jesus gets in the boat, he falls asleep, they get out into the middle of the sea, and a squall breaks loose and falls down upon their heads. And for some bizarre reason, with a storm raging around them, Jesus is sleeping on a pillow in the stern or the back of the boat. And you think, well, what does that mean? So they wake him up, they shake him up, and they say, Jesus, you got to help us, please. He yells at the storm stops, they freak out, and they go over to the other side of the land. And if you're from our cultural perspective, you listen to a story like that and you say, well, that's a bizarre fairy tale. Why would that ever happen? You wanted to make your God seem like he was powerful and like he can control the world. Okay. But it's more than a story with an analysis that's that shallow, that God's around. If you shake him up, he'll stop all the bad stuff in your life. It's deeper than that. It's more complex than that, and it's way more profound than that. Because Jesus is in the boat, and he gets out onto the sea. And in Mark chapter 4, it says this. It says, on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, let's go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. Which is a really interesting point on this story, that there are other boats or other witnesses or other individuals that are also out on the sea, but Jesus is not in their boats, right? So there's other people that are seemingly crossing the sea, following Jesus, this great miracle worker, this great teacher of this time, this revolutionary that was moving through the midst of the people, and people wanted to be near him. So there were other boats that followed along, and they were with him. And I'm looking at this picture, and I'm seeing the disciples, the followers of Jesus. I'm seeing Jesus, I'm seeing the sea, and I'm seeing the storm. And I'm saying, what do all these things represent? What do they mean? What are we looking at in this picture? And we have this picture of the sea, which is iconically a picture of chaos, the unknown, the unformed, the unfathomed, the you're not sure what's going to happen, and you're moving in your boat through life asking the question, will I make it to the other side? And the boat is not a thing of nature. It's neither storm nor sea. It's this man-made construct that these disciples are in. And what is that? It seems to be at least partially a picture of our life, that when we're moving through our life, which is often unknown, and we have this construct that we've created that we're living in, and the storm comes, that thing no longer is sufficient to take me where I need to go. So unless I call on God himself, I'm done for. And that seems like one picture that the story is telling. But if you know the historical context of the story, you know that at least a number of the disciples are actually fishermen. And Peter and James were fishermen on this sea. So they're super familiar with the sea. They're super familiar with the weather patterns. And if they're so scared that they think they're going to die, this is a very dangerous storm. And it says here in Mark chapter 4, verse 38, but he was in the stern, Jesus, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Love that. That their primary response is, why doesn't God care? And that seems to me the agnostic or the atheistic kind of conception when we have bad things happen on the earth, whether it's war or cancer or storm or whatever. This perspective is God doesn't care. And if there was a God, he would care. What's the deal? And the perspective of man in the face of storms is to say, God, why don't you care? And I've found myself doing that many times. I've found myself in pain or in worry or not knowing where money's going to come from at the end of the month and having a stack of bills to pay or whatever you're facing that is jarring, and saying, God, why don't you care? Why aren't you doing something about this? And this is kind of where the story flips, and Jesus gets shaken. They wake him up. They say, don't you see the storm? How are you sleeping in the midst of this? How is God seemingly asleep in the midst of a storm? And Jesus gets up and he walks maybe a step or two, maybe he walks from the stern to the bow. I don't even know if the bow is a thing, I hope, in a boat. He walks over and he rebukes the storm, and he says this. He says, "Peace, be still," and the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who is this then, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I think the actual perspective that Jesus wants us to have is that in the midst of our storm, on our journey over the ocean, over the unknown, in this boat that's this ramshackle, made by man plan that we're living and moving through in our lives, when the storm suddenly comes upon us, we're actually called to be like Jesus in those circumstances. In 1 John 2:6, whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way he walked. What does that mean? That means the call for a Christian is actually to follow the method of Jesus, to let him actually be the teacher and to emulate his behavior. So the primary response or the primary lesson that we're getting from the story is not shake Jesus when you're scared. It's to be like Jesus in the midst of the storm, to stand up when there's chaos around you. And I'm thinking about this story, and you have these guys that are, right, seasoned fishermen. They're out on the lake. It's a bad situation. They think they're going to die. It's got to be super dark. I mean, we're not talking about a place that has light pollution and they can see what's happening, or they have fog lights around the boat. It's got to be dark upon chaos with a storm around you. What do you do in that scenario? And if God came to earth to teach us how to live and be, our obligation then is to stand to the storm around it and command it to be calm. If you know Jesus, I encourage you this morning, stand up in your boat. You know, don't snivel, don't crawl, don't beg. Be a son and a daughter of God. He's living inside of you. The Spirit of God has sealed you with his promise. I encourage you to stand up to the chaos around you, wherever you find it, in your friends, in your family, in your home, and say, I'm going to declare the peace and the promise of God. I'm going to pray that solutions would come, that our government would be filled with wisdom and godly counsel. And in the midst of the storm, I'm not going to be shaken, but I'm going to walk as a son and a daughter of God. That's the whole idea of King's Church, that we would be like our Father, that we would be replicating his behavior. I hope that encourages you. I believe that God is looking for people to partner with. I think he wants an adventure and not sad, pathetic moralizers. And I think he wants people to look like him and believe like him and declare like him to the chaos around them. Peace, be still. Let his kingdom come here on earth as it is in heaven.